The time before 1914 is usually seen as the time before the First World War. But of course, people then did not know there would be a First World War. The time before 1914 was much more than a prelude to war. It was a time of tremendous changes. Man and machine were melting together into a new being made of steel and muscles, hurtling into an unknown future. Life was getting faster and faster. Clocks had become commonplace. Factories introduced time punch machines and conveyor belts. Efficiency was the watchword for urban dwellers, and even their personal lives sped up. For the first time, speed was a major factor in their leisure time, and leisure time itself was a new phenomenon. People were discovering for themselves the intoxication of speed. Exhilarated by tenths of a second and the breaking of new records, whether actively or as spectators. These are the Vertigo years.
– 1900 to 2013 seems a very short period, considering the long time span.
It was the century of women. The beginning of the century promised so much.
The early 20th century was all about speed. Sailing races were in vogue, but what really counted were fast engines.
I think the invention of the internal combustion engine brought on one of the great changes in the history of civilization. It really did. It revolutionized things much more than even a Marie Curie could in her laboratory, because suddenly there was movement. People encountered each other and discovered new horizons, new people, new ways of living.
No European country was more enthralled by speed than Germany. The Kaiser insisted on presenting the trophy personally.
It's testosterone, I'd say. I mean, that's how it was in ancient Rome. The gladiators with their swords, and then it goes on and it takes different forms on the battlefield and through to the internal combustion engine. And that brings about different kinds of challenge. With an engine, you can break through a lot of constraints. You can break through gravity. You invent the aeroplane.
After land and water, now humanity conquered the sky. Within a few decades, flying soapboxes had turned into complex aircraft. Otto Lilienthal in Germany and the Wright brothers were only three of many inventors who'd sought to defy gravity. Only 60 years later, men would land on the moon. In France, where flying was the height of fashion, Louis Blériot set out to be the first pilot to fly across the English Channel. Louis Blériot was a once wealthy producer of car parts who had all but ruined himself with his flying experiments. When he set off to cross the Channel in one of these Type 11 planes, everything was at stake. The problem was that the other 10 types had been complete flops, and he knew that if it wouldn't make it this time to bag the huge prize money, his dream of flying would be over. Blériot had already flown considerable distances over land, but as yet never over the open sea. The challenge was more psychological than technical. Blériot wasn't the only pilot trying to cross the channel that day. To get a head start on his competitors, he set off in his plane at 4:30 in the morning.
I am alone. For about 10 minutes I lose my bearings. It's a peculiar situation to be in the air above the channel without a compass. My hands and feet rest lightly on the levers. I let the flying machine find its own way. And then, 20 minutes after I left the French coast, I see the cliffs of Dover.
At 13 minutes past 5, Blériot landed on a golf course near Dover Castle. The channel crossing was the sensation of the era. Blériot was richer by £1,000 and London prepared a triumphal reception for him. Headlines on both sides of the channel announced, "England is an island no longer." But not everyone rejoiced at this. The latent fear of invasion began to grow. Countermeasures were required. Admiral John Fisher battled to rearm the Royal Navy. In the end, his plans were set in motion. A revolutionary new type of battleship was developed, the Dreadnought. The ship was christened by His Majesty King Edward in the uniform of an admiral of the fleet. The 20,000-ton, 530-foot Colossus was the beginning of a new era in the arms race. It had all begun quite harmlessly with the visit of a German boy to his grandmother, Queen Victoria. Kaiser Wilhelm made no secret of the fact that the motivation behind his expansion of the German fleet was very personal.
As a little boy, I was allowed to visit Portsmouth and Plymouth to admire the marvelous ships. That sparked in me the desire to build ships like that myself one day, and to possess a navy like the Royal Navy when I grew up.
In later years, he became an enthusiastic sailor.
30 seconds!
The German Empire had been founded in 1871 and was in no way as self-confident as the British Empire.
10,
Perhaps that was part of the reason why William II was so desperately keen to impress his uncle, Edward VII.
4, 3, 2, 1, time!
The main theatre of this war to impress was here at Cowes. The Cowes Week Regatta became a battleground where German and English yachts competed, but year after year the English yachts came home first. In the end, the emperor was exasperated and simply declared the rules were unfair and went home and founded his own regatta in Kiel. But the logic of competing and outdoing one another persisted. Never before had such unbelievable sums of money been spent on arms. Military expenditure was soon swallowing up 1/3 of the entire national budget in France and Russia, a little less in Great Britain, and almost 1/4 in Germany. The smokestacks of Krupp and Thyssen were red hot.
The Germans built their own dreadnoughts, which were ships which were technically just perhaps a year or two behind in terms of armament. But on the other hand, they were very sturdy ships. They had less range because the British were a country with an empire, and they wanted to have the option of sending those ships elsewhere, and for that you needed range. The German ships, to the British perception, appeared to be slanted to one thing only, and that was conflict between two large battle fleets in the North Sea.
The Kaiser was driven by a burning desire to break England's global predominance. His plans fitted perfectly with Germany's expanding heavy industries.
You know, you go from sort of toy boats to navies. It's like a kind of children's game that gets completely out of control.
A wave of national enthusiasm for its own force gripped the German Empire. Even Christmas was decked out with the trappings of future victories.
Morgen kommt der Weihnachtsmann, kommt mit seinen Gaben. Trommel, Pfeife und Gewehr, Fahnen und Säbel und noch mehr. Ja, ein ganzes Kriegesheer möchte ich gerne haben.
Within a few years, Russia, Austria, Italy, Japan, Germany and Great Britain had built more than 100 battleships, ever stronger and ever faster. The arms race was a game for men, but the factory work was increasingly done by women. They were even forging the heavy ships' chains. Wages were on the increase, but so was the pressure to deliver. Industry needed cheap labor, women. Women did the same work as men, but they were paid not much more than children, who themselves started in the factories at only 10 years of age. Suffrage, the right to vote, was a central demand of the women's movement, which began to organize in the industrial north of England. In the chain forge of Cradley Heath, protesting women put down their tools. Led by Mary MacArthur, the women were demanding a minimum wage. Today, Cradley Heath is an open-air museum where actors retell the story from the viewpoint of those striking workers.
My wife's on strike today. Absolutely incredible that it should come to this. This is the first time that I know of anywhere around here that women have gone on strike.
I've got all these kids to feed, no money coming in, so we've got Mary MacArthur, she's come to help us.
Women, they making a chain for them, they flog them off, they have a good profit, and we get a pittance at the end of the day for what our women have made. Carry on. This could have such far-reaching consequences for everybody around here. I mean, there could be insurrection. You don't know, do you?
Hyde Park Corner in London is a legendary place for free speech. And on the 21st of June 1908, people came here to demonstrate against the fact that half of all people in this country were disenfranchised and couldn't vote. These people, of course, were women. And the organizations that had called for this demonstration brought people here in 7 huge processions, in uniforms and with banners to demonstrate, men and women together, calling for Parliament to change the law. 500,000 turned up to demonstrate in Hyde Park. It was the largest gathering of people ever known. The women's movement had proved that it was a mass movement. Success eluded them all the same. The men in Parliament weren't interested in women's rights, but the women had gained in self-confidence. After 9 weeks of strike, the chain forgers of Cradley Heath got the minimum wage they'd demanded. Questions of social justice were in the air.
The Earl of Dudley, 8th richest man in the world. You know what he does sometimes for his workers? He's a really benevolent benefactor bloke, this chap. Right, every once in a blue moon, he gives them a picnic. A picnic. The richest man in the world, and all he is a bit of bread and butter and a cake and a cup of tea. And sometimes you think this gets you, because you're only sweating away. My mates, I'm dying at the age of 36. What for? To make somebody else rich?
Although Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the suffragettes, tried to conduct a moderate campaign, activists became increasingly radical. More and more of them were sent to jail, where many went on hunger strike. They were brutally force-fed.
The suffragettes were treated with great cruelty and violence, and they were force-fed and imprisoned, and we all know that story. And then on the other side, there are a great mixture of people, working women, intellectuals, radicals, activists, left-wing people, people from many different groups who clearly thought that women should have the vote and that there should be gender equality and that things should, and that also that women should be able to enter the professions, because the struggle for the vote is only part of the story.
At the Epsom races, Emily Wilding Davison attempted to get in the way of the king's thundering horse and was fatally injured. Her funeral was the last mass rally of the women's movement before the war. While suffragettes in England were laying their lives on the line, the public position of women in France was very different. There was Sarah Bernard, the great star of theatre and cinema. There were the novels of Colette that created huge literary sensations. Society hostesses like the Princesse de Polignac had everybody in their salons who was anybody. And in the studio of Auguste Rodin, there was a young woman who wasn't only his lover, but also a great artist in her own right. Her name was Camille Claudel. Claudel wasn't interested in politics, but in her own way she protested against the domination of men. She accused her lover and former mentor Rodin of plagiarizing her work and, in protest, destroyed her own sculptures. This desperate act was Claudel's last outburst on the path to madness. She ended her life in a psychiatric clinic. In his stage drama Elektra, Hugo von Hofmannsthal presented a picture of female rage to a horrified public.
Elektra! Was willst du? Rede, sprich, ergieße dich, dann geh und lass mich.
Starke Frauen waren nicht das gesellschaftliche Ideal. Und Anfang des 20.
Strong women were not society's ideal. And by the beginning of the 20th century, I think, there was already a much stronger debate about women making themselves independent. And their sexual drive was acknowledged.
Was für ein Werk! Nun müssen du und ich hingehen und das Weib und ihren Mann erschlagen. Schwester, sprichst du von der Mutter? Von ihr und auch von ihm. Ganz ohne Zögern muss es geschehen.
Also zumindest wurden natürlich Frauen, die
So naturally, women who were seen as erratic, who'd adopted masculine traits to force their way through, to combine their forces, these women were not admired.
quasi die Kräfte zu bündeln, die werden nicht verehrt.
In Richard Strauss's opera, the already overwhelming effect of Hofmannsthal's Elektra reached a new level of intensity. Many men felt threatened by these ecstatic new women. The fight for women's rights changed society. But no action without reaction. In his book On the Physiological Imbecility of Woman, the German doctor Paul Julius Möbius argued that with their, on average, smaller brains, women weren't even able to do anything else than look after household and children. Reactionaries all over Europe applauded him, but history had already passed him by. In summer, the wealthy Europeans fled away from the big cities, like here in Austria in the Attersee. On the opposite bank, Gustav Mahler wrote his second and third symphonies, and in the villa behind us, Gustav Klimt spent many summers painting. He lived there with his girlfriend Emilie Flöge, who used these summers to design beautiful, flowing dresses for women, dresses that no longer constrained them in corsets, but gave them a completely new feeling for their bodies. Emilie Flöge was not only Gustav Klimt's model and companion, she was a fashion designer too. Her reform clothes allowed women to put aside their corsets and discover their bodies as they were. Sports and movement brought a completely new experience to the lives of many women. Bicycles allowed them to leave the narrowness of bourgeois life quite literally behind them. In his novel Here Are Wings, Maurice Leblanc described two couples going on a cycling tour. Spurred on by speed and excitement, they take off their clothes and fall into an open-air orgy. Moralists were appalled at the potential effects of this anarchic vehicle on public morals. Women in particular, pedaling along without corsets and in reform clothes, were viewed as in danger and dangerous. It was claimed that their movements on the leather saddle could produce an unbearable erotic stimulation, making them hysterical or even sterile. Alice Guy, the first woman director in the history of film, parodied the supposed new roles of the sexes. Men were on their way to becoming the weaker sex. The new perception of women's sexuality was not only discussed in public, it slipped into bed with the couples themselves. With women already on the way to a new understanding of themselves, men had to come to terms with this new relationship. Men were not prepared for this sexual revolution. Now it was their turn to follow. In the new urban societies, it was no longer important from which village you came, who your parents were. New tribes came into being with new rituals. This was the high time of the socialist movement, of the Workers' Association, of the big political parties, and of football clubs. The great clubs like Manchester United, like Borussia Dortmund, or like Bayern Munich were all founded in these years. In Great Britain alone, there were 12,000 football clubs with 300,000 players and millions of male spectators. For them, the stadium was a place of retreat, where the world still functioned according to fixed rules. In her book A Survey of the Woman Problem, Austrian feminist Rosa Mayreder analyzed the situation in which men now found themselves.
The machine operator is merely the turner of a handle that could mostly be operated just as well by women and children. The strong arm, which in other social circumstances was indispensable for a man and was the basis of his authority, has become completely superfluous. So one reaches the paradoxical conclusion that through civilization, which has been almost exclusively the work of masculine intelligence, men themselves are working to destroy masculinity. The office, the branch, the registry, mere coffins of masculinity. But their monumental tomb is the modern city itself.
The elite ignored these changes and went hunting. Emperor Franz Joseph spent several weeks every year at his hunting castle in the Salzkammergut. In her analysis of masculinity, Rosa Mayreder wrote,
Like an old image that's still worshipped, although it's long since ceased to work miracles, the idea of masculinity still ruled in modern culture.
Besides pretty actresses, King Edward VII loved gambling, horse racing, and exclusive hunting parties. William II alone was said to have bagged 250,000 kills. From the cult of masculinity sprang medieval blooms. Duels became modern again. Real men reached for weapons to defend their honor. A positive epidemic of dueling broke out and quickly gathered pace. Sportsmen became the public representatives of a spectacular masculinity. In 1903, the first Tour de France was run. But muscle-driven speed had had its day. Sensational prototypes created new desires. But the triumphal procession of the automobile began with mass production.
(2013) is the time in which manual labor for many people in Europe is disappearing, being replaced by labor that's done by technology rather than by people. In 1913, there was always a calculation between what it cost to produce a labor-saving job and to employ cheap human labor. And that calculation usually resulted in driving down wages.
Abattoirs in Chicago gave Henry Ford the idea of introducing assembly lines where each worker had only one movement to perform. The assembly line and the 20th century are as inseparable as the 20th century and the car. In 1908, the first Model T rolled off the assembly line. It cost $825. Within 8 years, mass production techniques had driven the price down to $360. The buyer can have a car in any color he wants, as long as it's black. Henry Ford reputedly said time was money and black paint dried fastest.
According to our capitalist logic, time means money. Speed allows you to earn money. The faster you are, the better you use your time. That's why there's such an excessive striving for speed today. You always want to be faster than you are.
Europeans, frustrated with the outdated conventions of their own countries, frequently headed for America. The Austrian steel baron Karl Wittgenstein, the architect Adolf Loos, and the Italian car manufacturer Giovanni Agnelli all made this pilgrimage. Inspired by what he'd seen in the United States, Agnelli designed a factory which wasn't to be built until after the First World War, Lingotto in Turin. Here the production line went higher and higher, with the finished car on the roof in the open air. On a circuit more than half a mile long, every car was tested before being driven off. down a long ramp.
Intorno all'industria dell'automobile si creò una...
Within the automotive industry, there was a kind of mania that you could compare with the internet bubble at the end of the 20th century. There was an incredible enthusiasm for the automotive industry.
Italian Futurism too was a child of speed. Filippo Marinetti wrote Futurism's manifesto.
First, love of danger, courage, daring and revolt. We want to praise the man at the controls. We want to glorify war. The beauty of speed. We want to destroy the museums and fight morality, feminism and cowardice.
I futuristi sentivano l'esigenza di svecchiare il paese.
The futurists wanted to rejuvenate the country by an enormous wave of force, a massive provocation.
Tesa proprio a minare le fondamenta dell'accademia, della tradizione.
They wanted to subvert academic conventions and undermine tradition, and in the end provide a new aesthetic, artistic, literary model for Europe.
Artistico dal punto di vista letterario e finalmente anche europei in qualche modo.
Unintentionally, the futurists were helping to pave the road to fascism. But for them, it was all about speed.
In his painting Girl on the Balcony, Giacomo Balla says he was inspired by photography. It's like the single exposures of a film. You can see the different moments as the light falls on his daughter on the balcony.
It was a car accident that gave Marinetti the idea for Futurism. For him, a new era had dawned.
Space and time died yesterday. We're already living in the absolute because we've already created eternal, ubiquitous speed.
Seen at first distrustfully as dangerous horseless carts, cars quickly became the most exciting symbol of the 20th century. Cars made you mobile, cars were sexy, cars were dreams on four wheels, from the simple Model T Ford to the legendary Rolls-Royce. Cars had become heavier and more powerful. A race lasting several days over the highest passes in the Alps was intended to demonstrate man's victory over nature. 100 years later, the very same race was run again. The underbelly of this life of luxury was the misery of those at the bottom of the production chain, like these workers in Paris. Within a few decades, cities like Berlin and Vienna grew into metropolises where the working poor lived lives of bitter hardship. They had little share in the rising standards of living. They lived in slums on the edge of the towns or in tenement flats. Dozens slept in a single room. Shift workers shared the same bed, one using it by night, the other by day. Soup kitchens for the poor provided one small meal a day.
And the beginning of the 20th century is very fast transition. People were moving. You see that there's masses of people who used to live in the countryside, who lived by subsistence economy. They grew everything that they ate on farms, moved to cities, and were part of a big capitalist economy. So it's a huge change in the life of millions of people. I mean, you can see that the cities really were transformed mode of life in relation to the countries. So even politically, governments were afraid of the cities, right? Because cities were the place where revolution happened.
In Russia, conditions were even harsher, particularly for women, who suffered doubly from urban poverty. Many of them were forced into prostitution. It was a desperate situation for countless women, but neither the Tsar himself nor the parliament had any interest in seeing women as equal before the law. In Russia, democracy can still not be taken for granted.
Once people start thinking we need to start fighting for democracy and individual rights again with renewed force, they'll want different people in power, and they'll take to the streets. Putin is afraid of that. Putin is afraid of those who get other people out into the streets, who make other people think.
After Bloody Sunday, unrest broke out all over Russia. The Tsar responded with force. In Moscow, a crowd of 200,000 insurgent workers following the coffin of a murdered workman was attacked by troops loyal to the Tsar. Some of the rebel workers barricaded themselves here in the Prokhorov works and were shelled by the army with heavy artillery. The young factory worker Nikolai Pavlovich Schmidt even sided with the rebels and was promptly arrested by police. After days of interrogations, he was found in his cell with knife wounds in his lower arms and neck. The police recorded his death as suicide. In Russia, once again, the Tsar had succeeded in beating down the rebelling masses, so preventing a revolution. But a different revolution was already well underway. Women were on their way up. Three years after Louis Blériot's crossing, Harriet Quimby became the first woman pilot to fly across the Channel. Again and again, women activists sought to formulate alternatives to the structures of a man's world. At a peace conference in The Hague, delegates of the great powers issued statements about the possibility of arms reduction. But no one was really interested in peace. The Austrian writer Berta von Suttner was an observer at the conference. Her passionate commitment to peace was the result of her own personal experience. Living in Georgia at the time of the Russo-Turkish War, she had been horrified by the suffering she had witnessed.
I think you can compare the battle on the Shipka Pass with Stalingrad. The same futility, just dropping dead in the snow, in the cold.
Moved by this experience, Suttner wrote the novel Lay Down Your Arms, a passionate plea for peace that became a bestseller.
That Berta von Suttner had witnessed this kind of war, had seen it rationally and written about it, is really remarkable and important for the time.
For her commitment, she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1905. But Europe's men were not much interested in conducting politics through tolerance and peace. Vienna's mayor, Karl Lueger, had built his entire career by manipulating social hatred.
Ist der bodenständige, volksverbundene, arbeitsame Wiener so viel blöder als die anderen, dass er es nicht schafft, hinaufzukommen? Nein! Oder? Ist nur ehrlicher? Ja! Als wie wer? Der Jude!
When Adolf Hitler was a young, aspiring painter in Vienna, the mayor of the city was Karl Lueger. Anti-Semitism is a useful vehicle for making a career, he once said, but when you've made it, you have to leave it aside because it's a sport for the plebs. This sport for the plebs was played with great passion in Vienna, and Lueger made it acceptable in high society.
Wem gehören denn die Fabriken, die unser eingesessenes Kleingewerbe vernichten? Wem? Den Juden. Mitbürger! Wenn das 20. Jahrhundert ist, dann pfeift man drauf!
One of the most fervent admirers of Vienna's mayor was the young Adolf Hitler. He was then living in one of the city's homeless shelters. He applied to become a student at the Academy of Arts, but he wasn't accepted. In 1910, Karl Lueger died and was given a state funeral. It was to take more than 100 years before the Karl Lueger ring, named after him, was renamed Universitätsring. While male politicians were inciting social hatred, in a school in the center of Vienna, Eugenie Schwarzwald was educating the children in her school in a spirit of tolerance and openness.
Dr. Eugenie Schwarzwald
didn't want that dreadful system that she'd had in her childhood, the way schools were then, with punishments and beatings, and the teachers always right. And you're nothing at all. You just have to pay attention and see that you get through. She wanted to avoid that above all, and she did.
The building's roof served as a sports ground. Adolf Loos designed the interior space and taught architecture. Arnold Schönberg taught music. The only problem was the art teacher, Oskar Kokoschka.
The ministry didn't want to allow it because he'd had no teacher training. And Dr. Schwarzwald apparently said, "But Minister, he's a genius." And his reply was, "Geniuses aren't part of our curriculum."
The school's teaching goals were self-confidence and tolerance.
We did that at school too. It didn't matter at all what religion you belonged to. You had separate religion classes, but that was all. That's why, for me, this upheaval in 1938 was like a bomb exploding, because I had no idea.
When Hitler invaded Austria in 1938, the school was closed. Eugenie Schwarzwald fled the country. After 1900, the world accelerated so much that the old answers were no longer helpful. People like Eugenie Schwarzwald sought for new answers, beyond social convention, militarism and machines, Catholicism and communism, which could show the path to a better tomorrow.